So how do objects get a charge in the first place? Well, we've got this thing called the law of conservation of charge. It tells us charges are not created or destroyed. Should sound really familiar. We learned about the law of conservation of matter, mass, and energy, and they all say those things can't be created or destroyed either. So basically, if one object loses electrons, another has to pick them up. The electrons don't get created out of nothing, and they can't be destroyed. If you lose electrons, they have to go somewhere, not just disappear. There are three methods that we can use to charge an object. Probably the most common one is friction. Friction is when two things rub together. So basically, the electrons get rubbed off of one object and onto the second. Another way that you can transfer electrons is conduction. This is by direct contact or touch. So let's say you use some friction and you gave one of the objects a negative charge. Well, when you touch it to something else, that negative charge may transfer. The last one is induction. It's kind of like conduction. It's basically when things are really close but not quite touching. So induction is when you are not quite touching. I always remember it as like in the same area, close to each other, just not touching. Let's look at some examples, see if we can figure them out. In the first example, look, the girl has her hands on the top of this sphere. She's touching it, and it gives her static electricity. I can tell because her hair is standing up. She's touching it. Conduction, induction, or friction? Which one? That one's conduction. Conduction is when you're actually touching. Let's look at the next example. The girl combing her hair, and it starts to get a static charge. Well, the comb rubs against the hair. What do you think? Yep, that one's friction. Because the comb rubs against the hair, it's friction. It's rubbing together. Let's look at this next one. So we have this rod with positive charges near but not quite touching this metal sphere, metal ball, whatever it is. So they're close but not quite touching. That would be what? Yep, that one's induction. Not quite touching. Not sure what a pith ball is, but whatever a pith ball is, it's touching this rod, and you can see the positive charges are transferring. So that's going to be conduction because they are touching. Here we've got a piece of rubber, and we're going to rub it with some fur. Once you do that, the electrons get rubbed off of the fur onto here. So here's all the electrons building up a negative charge, and now the fur is positive. Because of the rubbing, this would be an example of, you guessed it, that one's friction. Here's a last example. So it looks like the balloon has mostly negative charges. There's a few positives, but mostly negatives. When you bring it near the wall, it's actually going to kind of repel a little bit the other electrons. So see how these electrons are kind of running away? And we're left with just positive charges. Well, here's the key. The balloon's near the wall, but is it touching? Nope, not quite. So this would be, you guessed it, induction. Here's a question for you. How is saran wrap able to cling to food containers? It gets a static charge. How do you think that happens? Take a moment to think about it. Well, here's the thing. It's friction. So as you are pulling it out of the box, the roll inside is going round and round and round in circles. And as it rubs against the other layers on the roll and against that box, it becomes statically charged because of the friction, because they're rubbing together. All right, you're going to watch a short video. It's a cartoon. And as you go through the cartoon, you're going to see multiple examples of friction, conduction, and induction. Try to identify them as you see them.
Come on. That's the dog. What did they want from me?
Come on, Georgie.
Oi!
Oh, hello. That's it. Oh.
Come on. Turn around. And the other side.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, no.
This machine is called a Van de Graaff generator. When you turn the handle, the belt inside rubs against the rest of the machine, charging it by friction. Both people in these pictures get their static charge by conduction because they're touching the machine. When you pick up static electricity by direct contact, by touching, that's a great example of conduction. This is an example of induction because the charge transferred from Mr. Bean to the trash without touching. He walked near it, but he didn't actually touch the trash can. Just being close to it was enough for that attraction to happen. Finally, we have the example where Mr. Bean and the security guard shake hands. They're touching. This is conduction because we have direct contact. We have touching.